Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and he will talk about mathematics, recursion and complexity. A few words about Professor Gadgil. He did his PhD at California Institute of Technology. He did some postdoctoral work at Stony Brook, State University of New York, and he has been since then at Indian Institute of Science. I must say a few words about the theme of his talk. I'm afraid I cannot say too much because it's really very wide range of topics that he has put on the title, but I will say a few words nevertheless. You see in the title that there is some mathematics and then some words which are more properly in the domain of mathematical logic. For the uninitiated, it may seem like these are two different things, but issues of logic, topics in logic directly impinge on our understanding of mathematics. I wish to give an example. When you study topological spaces, the most important ones to study are manifolds, and there are these problems, classical problems, almost in any branch of mathematics. You want to classify objects of your study, just list out one of each kind, and then you want to, given an object belonging to that domain, you want to know where in that list it fits in. And it is known that you cannot classify manifolds of dimension 4 or higher. I understand there are some BSc students here, so manifolds are higher dimensional analogues of surfaces. We are all familiar with surfaces. Manifolds of higher dimensions, dimension 4 onwards, it is simply impossible to write a list of them, and then given an object, you cannot, there is no algorithm to decide which one the object that you have in hand, that it is isomorphic to the one on the list that you have written down. So there is this word recursion there, and there are this complexity. I think Siddhartha will talk about them in greater detail, but just briefly I want to say that there is a distinction between recursive set and recursively enumerable set. So this distinction is very subtle, and it accounts for many important consequences in whatever object of, so for example, in group theory, for example. Okay, so many questions are regarding structure of finitely presented groups depend on this very subtle distinction. Now I request Siddhartha Gadgil to give his talk.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. This talk will be about lots of things, but more or less involving mathematics, logic, computation, rest of the world. In fact, it will be quite simple things that I'll be talking about. Maybe Professor Parmeshwaran Sankaran made deeper remarks in his introduction than I will in the course of the talk itself. But I'll begin quite far away from language, from mathematics, well, apparently far away, with grammar. I mean, grammar is something we study in school, and in some sense we study entirely the wrong way. And so here is from what is called a Berkeley parser. So I should say a few things about what these things are. Here's a sentence, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon that is dreaming. It's not a best, it's actually rather hard work for a parser to deal with this, and there are probably some mistakes. Okay, but that's not significant. Let me just say two things. First, what is this Berkeley parser business? It's something online. It's there is also something called a Stanford parser, which in my limited experience works better. But this one gives you this tree online, so I could just make a screenshot and put it here. That's why I have used this one. But I mean, that's not the real story. So these are, parser is something which takes a sentence and parses it, which means understands its structure. Now, how it does this is not the main topic of this talk. I'll come back to that briefly at the end. the main topic is the structure of the sentence itself. And the reason for this is something that has been understood for a long time, which is language and logic and parts of mathematics have very common roots. So I'll start with language and go on to logic and mathematics. See, this root, this is the sentence. Well, all the details don't matter, but it has a noun phrase and a verb phrase. You may dimly remember that sentences have subjects and predicates, okay? And plus there's a conjunction which is not normal in prose, but this is a bit of poetry. Now, ignore a lot of details, as I said. What does a verb phrase have? It has a verb and a noun phrase. Now, the noun phrase has a noun phrase and a, this is a prepositional phrase, and then there's an injunction and a noun phrase and a sentence itself, and then down here there's a verb phrase and a verb phrase. Well, I mean, a lot of details are here, and the details of this particular sentence are not relevant. What is relevant is this process seems to go on forever. Okay, it seems as if it can go on forever, that you take your sentence and you break it into pieces, and you break it in, those pieces themselves could be broken into pieces, and it doesn't seem to be getting simpler all the way along. Of course, for a specific sentence in a rather superficial way, it's getting simpler. That is, the number of words is always going down in each piece, because the number of words adds up, but this is the point I want to make from this example. Okay, so that is, you take a sentence, you can break it, but those constituents, okay, so sentence is made of noun phrases, verb phrases, etc. Okay, so everyone will be familiar with nouns and verbs. A phrase is a set of words which has the same role grammatically as a noun or a verb in the case of a verb phrase, etc. Okay, and the point here is noun phrases, verb phrases, etc. can contain noun phrases, verb phrases, etc. So you have a recursive structure. And so somehow this is something in philosophy for a long time, the whole is more than its parts. Well, in a recursive structure, the whole is, well, it's more than its parts in a rather superficial sense of being longer, but in terms of structure, it's no more complex than its parts. So your whole can be decomposed into parts, but the parts can be just as complex. I mean, the rules for decomposing the parts allow just as much complexity as the whole itself. So you can have sentences of arbitrary complexity. In fact, that was quite a complex sentence. And one of the remarkable facts of human intelligence is we can understand this. That is, most humans can understand, at least in one language, sentences of not arbitrary complexity, but of considerable complexity. Okay, and a parser is a computer trying to do the same thing. So this is just to emphasize this point, since recursion was in my title and it will come in various forms throughout. I mean, in some sense, we learn grammar, I said, the wrong way, which is we pretend it's like everything else. Okay, so molecules are made of atoms are made of elementary particles, well, they are made of, I don't know, quarks and whatever else and whatever the theories are. But we're used to studying any natural system or anything in the world by saying that these are the parts and then these are how we put together, and those parts in terms of further parts and so on. But in case of something like language, and as we'll see in mathematics, the parts are no simpler. So this process, so things do not reduce. Okay, so you have so this is sort of like invention versus discovery. It's a fundamental distinction. Things can be recursive or sort of, recursive versus reductionist view of many things. And in some sense, the irony is that we are at an intellectual level very determined reductionists, making lots of mistakes in the process, okay, while we all understand language. Anyone in this room can understand language. So our brain is capable of handling recursion. We just find it hard to accept it. Well, so away from language. As I said, I'll come back right at the end to these language issues, but now we are going to go into mathematics, bit of logic, and see recursion playing other roles. So here's an equation. It's an identity, which, as we heard, was known to ancient Indian mathematicians. For all x, sin x the whole squared plus cos x the whole squared is 1. I've written it this way rather than the usual square just because it's clearer. I mean, we are used to the other abbreviation. Well, what makes up this? X is a variable, hence a term. So you have to think a noun is a noun phrase. Okay. So a single word can have a meaning. It's like a single word X, which is a variable. So it's a term. One is a constant and it's a term. So variables and constants are terms. We have a bunch of functions here: sine, cosine, square, and plus. Of course, the first three take one input, and the second one takes two inputs. Functions always give one output. Okay, and this is what is called first order logic, in which everything belongs to the world. Okay, so we don't make distinctions of what it belongs to, so everything belongs to the world. Equality is a relation. Okay, so what is a relation? It takes a certain number of inputs. It could be one or more. In this case, it takes two, and its output is true or false, unlike a function whose output is another object. Okay, so you have objects and then you have true or false, nothing else. Now you get terms. These are like phrases. By combining this, if you apply a function to a term, you get a term. So sin x is a term. So sin x is a term, cos x is a term. Now sin x is a term, so I apply a function to it, I get another term. Similarly, cos x squared is a term. Now here what I have done is put two inputs to a function with two inputs. So you still get a term, etc. Okay. If you put just one input, you will get actually a function. That's called Curry-Howard isomorphism, which is an interesting thing in logic and including in sort of applications, but that's not relevant here. This is what is called a formula. So I took a relation with two inputs and gave it two inputs. The formula, it's either true or false. That doesn't mean that we know whether it's true or false or it's decidable or anything, but its sort of value is true or false. And also the whole equation is a formula. Okay. So for all x, sin x the whole squared plus cos x the whole squared is 1. So this is a formula, and if you take a for all or there exists quantifiers on top of formula, you get formulae. There are other ways in which you can combine formulae to make formulae. Okay. So this is a sort of brief view of logic. I'm not going to go into formal logic any more than this in this lecture. But the point I want to emphasize is that the logic also has a recursive structure, and hence you can have arbitrary complexity. And we are used to that. You can have very, very complex. Yeah, sorry.
I'm slightly unclear on what exactly constitutes a formula.
A formula is a predicate, a relation applied to the right number of terms. So equality is a relation applied to two terms. Yes, a formula need not be true. So formula simply means you take a relation which has n-ary, which has n inputs, and put n terms into it. It's so sin cubed x plus cos cubed x equals 1 is also a formula. It is sometimes true and sometimes false. It's usually false. Okay. If I put for all x, then it will be just false. If I put there exists x, it will be true. Okay. So formula can be obtained from sort of recursively. So this one was the step where you took an n-ary relation and put in n terms, but you can also quantify over the variables, and you can also say one formula equivalent to another, one implies the other, not that, etc., to get more formulae. Okay, I have not given you the complete rules. What is actually somewhat amazing in this, just from a historical point of view, is Frege invented this, what's called predicate calculus. As you will all know in mathematics, you can actually eliminate functions and replace them by relations, but it's much more efficient to keep functions separately. So predicate calculus is because there were no functions formally, just predicates, in 1850, Frege. And it's actually an adequate description for much of mathematics. Okay, but as I said, this was sort of a couple of points here, I think. So I just wanted to point out mathematics has a recursive structure because you can apply things to a similar nature, and hence a sort of things can get arbitrarily complex, and also sort of the parallel between language and logic, which is again well understood. But now we'll go to somewhat simpler looking things. We are used to recursion in other senses in mathematics. Many functions can be recursively defined. N factorial. Okay. 0 factorial is 1. N plus 1 factorial is n plus 1 times n factorial. Okay. For non-negative integers, this gives you the definition of factorial function. Okay. In any programming language which allows recursion, this is the first example. They will always tell you that this is what you, how you would do recursion, and then they'll tell you this is how you should never do it. Okay, that's another story which I won't get into, but this is a definition. I guess a much more celebrated example, because we have seen, is the Fibonacci series, which is 1, 1, and then each term after that is the sum of the two previous ones. I guess many of you would have seen this. So you have 1, 1, and then the third term is 1 plus 1, which is 2. And now the fourth term is 2 plus 1, which is 3. And now I can't remember, there were 2 and 3, I guess. So 2 plus 3, 5 will be the next term, and so on. So the first term is 1, the second term is 1, and the n plus second term is going to be the nth term plus the n plus first term. This is something which has a bit of a cult status in our culture. There's even a Fibonacci quarterly, and the golden ratio, which is the ratio of asymptotic ratio of these numbers, is supposed to govern everything, including your age and so on. But I won't talk about that. The point here is that you frequently have things defined recursively. I think the point I want to make is that here it's just one function, or you could have 2 or 3 defined in terms of other things. So since functions have parameters, you can have a much richer recursive structure than you had in logic or language, where you put terms and other terms, or words and other words. Here you can take the value at one point in terms of the value at other points here. So one functions at one value depending on the same function at another value. Okay. So recursion is this kind of definition. Well, the main theme I haven't got to yet is what I would call perils of recursion. This is a sort of introductory slide. This isn't the main point of the lecture here. Recursion gives you so much complexity that things can go wrong. And the main story in this lecture is things going wrong. If you understand where they go wrong, you get very interesting mathematics out of it. Okay? And that is the story. So first, let's just take perils of recursion, as I said. What can go wrong? Well, this was just my rough title, loopy loops. Here I am defining a function recursively. F of 1 is 1. F of k is f of k over 2 if k is even. And it's 3k, f of 3k plus 1 if k is odd. Okay? So f of 6 is f of 3. Now 3 is odd. So you replace 3 by 3 times 3 plus 1, f of 10, which is f of 5, which is f of 16, which is f of 8, which is f of 4, which is f of 2, which is f of 1, which I said was 1. Okay. Now the way I have defined this, I'm of course pulling a fast one on you, as you might have suspected from the funny definition. The way I have defined it, you can think that if I could calculate f of 6 at all, it would end up as 1, because there's no rule that will ever let things go away from 1. But do you think this defines the function for all integers? I mean, I started with 6 and it took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 steps to get to 1. Okay, and going sometimes increasing, sometimes decreasing. So what's the guess of people? Do you think this gives a well-defined function? Well, actually, I first encountered this in what I'll tell you. It was a computer science course, which I'll mention about a few weeks ago. And so question is, do the above rules define a function? Well, it's actually what's called a Collat's conjecture in number theory. Okay, this is an open problem. This particular example I've pulled straight out from Wikipedia. I mean the number 6, etc. I've disguised this open problem. Okay, just for fun. So the problem is, of course, forget the function f. Start with a number. If it's odd, divided by 2. If it's even, divided by 2. Start with an integer, positive integer. And if it's even, if it's even divided by 2, if it's odd, triple it and add 1. Question is, do you eventually end up with 1? If you got 1, then of course you would get 4 and 2 and 1 again. So it's like a dynamical system. Question is, does everything end up in the orbit 1, 2, 1, 4, 2, 1, 4, 2, 1, 4, 2? So if you have an orbit, 1 will get will get tripled and 1 will be added. So 1 will go to 4. Okay, so this is an open problem in number theory. Okay, so just for fun I put it. Okay, so it's easy to construct recursive definitions that do not terminate. So here, just for fun, I put one which is an open problem, whether this gives you a function or not. But I just want to say that if you simply write down formulae like the Fibonacci series and so on, and you don't take some care, you think of them as programs, that is recipes for calculating, and the calculation can go on forever. Okay? I mean, in the case of Fibonacci numbers and so on, the value at n depended only on earlier values. In that case, it terminates, no problem. But if you allow a sort of more general notion, you can write a recipe. That doesn't mean it's going to give you an answer. You can go on and on running. This is something which will come back later. This isn't my main point of what can go wrong, but it's very important for later. This is the main point. Okay? In fact, Gödel recognized this, and that is where I'll be headed towards some bits of Gödel's famous work, not quite from Gödel's point of view, which is if things are rich enough that they can refer to themselves, which happens exactly when things are recursive, and then plus a little more, then interesting things happen. Okay? So this goes back a long way. It's a Greek philosophy or something. Liar paradox. Liar paradox is this statement. This statement is false. And you ask, is this statement true or false? Well, if it's true, of course it's false, so it's false. And if it's false, well, then it's not false, so it's true. And because it's so, if it was true, it would be false, and if it was false, it would be true. Okay, there's sort of well, I mean, obviously something fishy. So not so interesting, but you get something more interesting out of it, which is called Russell's paradox, which again many of you would have heard of. You consider the set of all x such that x is not an element of x. I'm not saying x is not a subset of x. You just look at all the sets which are not elements of themselves. Okay? Every set is contained in itself. And then you ask, is S an element of itself? Well, now you look at the definition. If S is in S, it violates this condition, so it's not an element of S. On the other hand, if S is not in S, it satisfies this condition, so you can put it in here. Okay. In fact, Russell worried about this for a long time, and even comments about how he felt he shouldn't be worrying about something so childish for such a long time. And in a way, it is childish. Such paradoxes were actually discovered by Cantor. But Cantor, being essentially an analyst who had turned to set theory for understanding analysis, just chose to ignore them, saying that they are of no real consequence. It's Cantor's diagonalization argument, which many of you would have seen, is what is very similar to this. And Cantor's paradox was that the set of all sets is the power set of all sets has to be bigger than the set of all sets. The argument is very similar to this, but Cantor has of course shown that the power sets are always bigger than what you have. Okay, so that is again on the side. So well, I mean, as I said, this led to a sort of crisis in foundations. Didn't really affect most of mathematics, this kind of paradox. I mean, but just as a side remark, if you look at modern constructions of set theory, they are explicitly recursive. That is, you start with a few ingredients. You can start with the empty set and at least one infinite set, and basic constructions which let you build up from this, recursive rules of construction, and all the complexity of mathematics comes from just a few rules. Okay, and a bunch of course, you have the axioms of set theory which go with this. So, but more interestingly, of an extremely complicated elaboration of this paradox led to Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Okay. Or you could consider it an extreme elaboration of Cantor's diagonalization argument, which is very, very close in nature to Russell's paradox. And that is going to be the major theme of this lecture, not Gödel's proof, and that's why I'm not right now telling you what the incompleteness theorem is, and or how Gödel did it and so on. It's an extremely complicated process. But here's a much more interesting paradox. I guess it's more interesting because the other one is obviously childish. I mean, you'll feel that you should sort of dismiss it rather than think about it. But this is a bit more intriguing, at least I find it much more intriguing. Consider the integer given by this. Okay? The smallest positive integer that cannot be described in at most 100 words. This is what is called Berry's paradox, interestingly. It was actually published by Russell, Bertrand Russell, of the same person as Russell's paradox. Berry was the librarian at Oxford, and apparently Russell says that Berry told him this paradox. So he was the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in at most 100 words. Now, of course, as many of you would have spotted, the above gives a description of this integer in at most 100 words. Okay. So the number of words in this sentence is much less than 100, and here you have a description in less than 100 words. So you have a contradiction. So now that integer, whatever it is, has been described in less than 100 words. Okay. So this more interesting paradox, hence, can be elaborated, and this is what I'll talk about. Chetin, who's, I'll tell you, so Chetin, along with Kolmogorov, is a founder of algorithmic information theory, and so what I'm going to talk about is his proof of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Roughly speaking, you tweak this a little bit, and you'll have to do a lot more than that. But the smallest positive integer that we can prove cannot be described in at most 100 words. Okay? So you can tweak this a little bit. I mean, cannot be described is something which is hard to pin down, but thanks to Gödel and Turing and of course back to Frege and so on, what do we mean by we can prove can be pinned down better than what is possible and what is not possible. Possible is too metaphysical. So in some sense, you can, smallest integer that we can prove cannot be described in at most 100 words, will not give you the same contradiction. But instead, yeah, sorry. No, this is not a paradox. Instead, the conclusion is not a paradox. Huh? The first one is a paradox. No, there are at most finitely many numbers that can be described in at most 100 words, right? Because there are only finitely many sentences in at most 100 words, and each sentence describes at most one word. Yeah, so this is a paradox. I mean, if you can make sense of it, it's a paradox. So in some sense, you'll get something from the fact that you can't make sense of it. And things like description, yeah, so I didn't say that. Things like can be and so on are the sort of notions you can never make really meaningful, but a description can be made meaningful, as can a proof. Okay? So we can prove cannot be described. So when you sort of make sense of the fact that what you mean by we can prove and what you mean by described, okay, we'll come back to it. Well, this won't be a paradox. I mean, instead, what you conclude is that there are true statements that we cannot prove. Okay. This is the famous Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It says that if you look at arithmetic, ordinary integers with all their properties that we know, and ordinary logic, then there are statements about this you can write, okay, which are true, but there is no proof, given the usual rules of deduction, or in some sense given any consistent rules of deduction. Okay. So given any rules of deduction. So that comes, you can sort of get an impressionistic idea of how this is linked to this. It's not a very direct link, and that's what we'll head towards a little bit slowly. So here, I'll give a warm-up on how to use complexity ideas to prove mathematics results. And this will be now Chetin's proof that there are infinitely many primes. Okay. All this is from a book which I'll point out at the end, not all this, but Chetin's work anyway, written by him quite recently, a couple of years ago. He has written several books. Of course, there are at least 3 proofs that there are infinitely many primes, each of which have a lot of significance. The original one goes to Euclid. Euler's proof there are infinitely many primes comes down to the harmonic series not converging. Many of you may have seen it. If you haven't, well, you should. It's the birth of analytic number theory. the proof that Euler's proof that there are infinitely many primes. It led to the Euler zeta function and Riemann zeta function and so on. Chaitin's proof is interesting because it's based on algorithmic information, though in principle this could be regarded as a pure counting argument. Okay? It's just that thinking in terms of information makes you know what to count and so on. So first let's start with a simple point. Using n binary digits, a binary digit is either 0 or 1, we can represent at most 2 to the n numbers. Okay? This is some very basic combinatorial fact that if you have each position you have 2 choices. So in n positions you have 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 choices, so you can represent 2 to the n numbers using n binary digits. Second fact, every number n has a prime factorization. Okay, I have written it this way: p to the k, q to the l, etc., etc. p, q, etc. are primes, and these are the exponents. Okay. Uniqueness of prime factorization, by the way, is much harder than existence. Not that it's a hard result, but we don't use that. So just to point out that we use the really elementary fact that you have a prime factorization. Okay. Now each of these exponents are at most log to the base 2 of n. In fact, they are at most log to the base p of n, but every prime is at least 2. So again, a very elementary observation tells you k, l, etc. are all at most log 2 to the n. So suppose there are only m primes. What do you get? Then we can represent all m numbers up to 2 to the m using at most this many digits. I'll explain this number. M times log 2 to the m plus 1 binary digits. Why is this? How do I represent a number n? I say I know it has a prime factorization. Okay. This is unique, but even if I didn't know it was unique, pick one. And I will just tell you the values of k, l, etc. Okay. So if you know, to know n, it's enough to know these exponents, k, l, and so on. Okay. How many of them there are there? Only m. Because we have assumed there are only finitely many primes. So the number of numbers there are just these many, m. Okay? And to represent each of these, you need, to represent a number, you need how many digits? The log of that number, and perhaps add 1. Okay? Actually, if you do bookkeeping carefully, you might get a slightly bigger number. But essentially, this is the idea. Okay? So you just have to store the exponents, and in real life where there are infinitely many primes, this sort of doesn't help because there are a priori infinitely many exponents. I mean, there's no bound on the number of exponents. But if the bound on the number of exponents is m, you will get m times log 2 to the m plus 1 digits to store numbers up to 2 to the m. But actually you need m digits, little m digits. And we all know that log grows slower than x, log x grows slower than x. So if little m is large enough, you will get a contradiction. Okay? So briefly, to put this argument, as I said, this is really a counting argument, but to put it in a sense of sort of information, storing it, all it's saying is if there were only finitely many primes, you could determine each number by knowing the exponents, and the exponents are much smaller than the number itself, and there's a fixed finite number of them. So you could compress all the information in the numbers for every number, and this is impossible. Okay? It's not difficult to make this precise. So this is Chaitin's proof, sort of showing how an sort of algorithmic view, information view, gives you results in mathematics. Okay? So now coming back towards what was the main theme, which is, as I said, heading toward Gödel's incompleteness. So Church defined recursive functions, which Professor Shankaran mentioned earlier. So I won't tell you the details of these. Okay? So they were defined but as functions that can be built using basic functions like 0 and constants and projection and successors. So these are all partial functions. Sorry, I should clarify what they are. They are functions from maybe 3 positive integers to 2 positive integers, but they are not necessarily defined on all tuples of positive integers, but some subset of that, some domain. So that's why they're called partial functions. Their domain is not all tuples, but some subset of tuples to another subset of tuples. Using some sort of basic functions, you can compose them. You use a primitive recursion. Just to clarify, since I confused the issue with loopy loops, this is honest recursion where things at k plus 1 are defined in terms of things at k. So it terminates, and some implicit definition. Okay. The details don't really matter, but the point is that you start with some very simple functions and a procedure for generating new functions. And these procedures are compositions and recursions, implicit definitions, which we all do in all the time in mathematics. And Church made his thesis, as it is called. This is the old meaning of the word thesis, not PhD thesis, but rather every thesis has an antithesis and that kind of sort of philosophical arguments and so on. Church's thesis, what he claimed is that recursive functions are the computable functions. I'll come back to this statement in the next slide after a slight elaboration. But let me just say what he was trying to say. Now it's clear that if you know functions, it's clear that the basic functions can just be computed by hand. It's clear if you can compute functions, you can compose their composition. And if you do these things correctly, recursion and minimum, it is clear that at least on their domain of definition, okay, any function which is defined, built up from things you can compute using these processes can be computed. Okay. What Church claimed that these are the only functions you can compute. That is, any way you know of computing functions from n tuples of integers or subsets of n tuples of integers to n tuples of integers can be computed using these methods applied recursively. Okay. Now, what is the justification for this? Well, let's go a little bit further and talk a bit about Turing machines. Incidentally, this happens to be Turing's centennial, along with Ramanujan's 125th birthday. And Turing was born in India. So if you are talking about Indian born, here's another person to celebrate. Of course, he was British and his parents were British. And he had a major role in the World War II, which I'll mention. So Turing machine is a physical model of a computing machine. Okay? And today, I mean, Turing had to explain this very, very elaborately. Today, here's a computer projecting it. Okay? And Turing model is an accurate enough machine for that, a model for that, and vice versa. So you don't have to elaborate too much. But what happens is, for an input, it gives you an output, or it can run forever. Again, this doesn't need much elaboration. All our devices, whether they are computers or any other electronic devices, hang from time to time. Okay? So we know that things can get into infinite loops. Yeah. And if you ever do a program, if you have ever programmed to any significant extent, you have written a program that runs forever, or you're a genius, I think. Yeah. So this is a physical model of a computer. It has an interesting history. There were, of course, a series of physical models. Okay, there's the analytic engine and so on, which were never built, and they all go back to what is called a Jacquard loom, in some sense, which was built around 1800. It was a loom. It was meant to weave cloths, and I think the special feature of the Jacquard loom is very important from this point of view. Okay, so loom was used to weave cloths. Before that, so this was a precursor of what would be an electronically controlled loom. Before that, if you wanted a different pattern, you built a different machine. So each machine gave you a certain pattern on cloth that you wanted. Instead, with the Jacquard loom, you gave information on the pattern encoded in a punch card. Okay? Punch cards, I think I'm sort of old enough to have seen them as residues from old computers, though never to have actually used one. So they are the old form of USB drives or something, but they go back to early 1800s, and they were used to specify you punch holes according to some code, and the Jacquard loom weaved a pattern according to that. Okay, so that was an input, and it weaved out a pattern. So Turing machine sort of built on a series with that, but there was something really remarkable which Turing discovered, and I'll tell you what context also. There is something called a universal Turing machine. Turing showed there's a universal Turing machine. It takes as an input a description of any Turing machine. So Turing machine can be described in words or in some appropriate code and its input. Okay. So given the Turing machine T, it has an input, and suppose with input I it has some output O, then the universal Turing machine will also output O. Okay. So this is one Turing machine that can do the work of all Turing machines. Should say this had a very, very practical reason why you would want such a thing, because what Turing was working on at that time was cracking codes. And in fact, Turing was instrumental in cracking the Enigma cipher, which was used by Nazi Germany, and hence in the verdict, in the result of World War II. These days, there are recently, I think, some movies and so on. It's Turing's 100th year. This is being very much celebrated because his life history is also quite sad after that. Yeah, and though, yeah, so universal Turing machine, it can take as an input description of any Turing machine T and its input and output the result. So back to the crypto system. So you wanted a machine to crack the crypto systems. And just like I was saying in the case of looms, the idea was that for each code you try to build a machine which will crack that code. Those days people really just built hardware. Of course, there were no computers. But what a universal Turing machine says is that you build this once and for all, which is actually built, and then you can crack any code by feeding in some appropriate T into it. So if you have any machine that cracks code, the universal machine can crack the code if you give it the right, what we would call software today. Okay, so this idea of a hardware and that software can do all that hardware can do is goes back to this universal Turing machine. And now here was a theorem which I don't know who proved, but one of the leading logicians of that time. It turns out that the Church's recursive functions are exactly the same class of functions as outputs of Turing machines. And Turing had an elaborate paper where he argued that Turing machine is universal not in this sense, but in the sense that any computation you can do physically can be done by a Turing machine. So the Church-Turing thesis says computable functions are the outputs of Turing machine. So the evidence for this early on, okay, and this just continues to build with every computer which or electronic device which agrees with this. So basically there were many people had many definitions of what computable functions were. Every definition turned out to either coincide or be a subset of recursive functions. So Church-Turing thesis, including two different ones of Church. So Church-Turing thesis is seems to be very real. I should just comment that you can never actually prove something like this. Right? So you could imagine some physical device based on some quantum gravity effect, and I throw n pieces of chalk into it, and it spits out f of n tennis balls. Okay? Some physical device somebody has given me, and that will give me a function, provided every time I throw in n chalks, I get the same number of tennis balls spit out by that. And of course, perhaps that is an uncomputable function. Okay? Just cardinality arguments will tell you they're there, but there are much deeper reasons. But perhaps those could be ruled out. Cardinality arguments sort of give you silly counterexamples which may be ruled out, but the deeper counterexamples. So you sort of believe this simply because every device anyone has built or anything anyone has imagined fits with this. And one would believe it. But I just want to point out you can never prove such a thing from first principles, as I said. I don't know in what the Kolmogorov and so on have issues. Maybe within a physical model you can say that whatever you mean by computable, because some of the propositions of computable ones were based on real numbers and mechanics, and they also turned out to fit within this class. So just coming to the modern world along this theme, so modern computer is in fact a universal Turing machine. Okay, that is, given any Turing machine, it can simulate it, as we would call it, and in fact even a smartphone is. In fact, this not PowerPoint, but in fact a browser in a computer is already a universal Turing machine because it runs a language called JavaScript, which is as good as a universal language. So it's not just your computer, but small subsets of it which are universal Turing machine. In fact, in any general purpose language, well, there's software which is so given any recursive function, there's a program which computes it. This is extremely easy to see because you can compute the basic functions, and you can compute compositions, and you can compute with recursive definitions, etc. So given any language, including, as I said, things running within a browser, not necessarily on the whole computer. Okay. But the more interesting thing, and this is the point which every time you say it, things are sound very fishy. So in any general purpose language, you can write what is an interpreter for that language itself. Okay. What does that do? It takes as input a program in that language and the input to that program, and gives as output the result of running the program P with input I. Okay. So if you have a program in a language, C or Python or whatever you wish, and give it an input and it outputs O, then this interpreter, when given as an input the program P and I, for one followed by the other or whatever convention you like, will output O again. Okay. So this somehow sounds very fishy. In fact, a lot of the, up to the 1940s, apparent contradictions with life can be viewed from this point of view. You say one or the other is not a big deal. You can have a very simple language which has interpreters. Namely, you can have a language where the output of every program is the number 0. Okay. Then any program in fact is an interpreter. It just ignores the input and output 0. Okay. That is sort of like a crystal. It can grow or something like that, but nothing interesting is happening. On the other hand, the first thing is that it can generate all recursive functions. Okay. So it can generate, it has a very rich range of behavior, but you can write a program for itself in itself. Seems paradoxical, and that's what I said, recursion is intellectually hard to accept. Okay. So living so it's almost like the language is living. In fact, many languages will provide you a one-line code which will give you an interpreter. Okay. So computable functions in modern world are just outputs of program in a general purpose language. So you take whatever program, general purpose language you like, outputs in that. So you don't have to know what a physical Turing machine is, etc., etc. Okay. So now some of a couple of interesting points here. So by the rules of logic, we can list all meaningful formulae. I told you how to generate formulae from variables, constants, and functions, and so on. So any formula which is meaningful, not necessarily true, can be written by these rules. Okay, just like rules of grammar. But what Turing discovered in his proof of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, but Turing didn't observe this. Post observed that Turing's proof contained this statement implicitly. Post is a logician. Is we can also enumerate all proofs of theorems recursively. That is, we can systematically write down all proofs of all valid theorems in logic. Okay. I mean, what is left for mathematics to do in some sense? We can list all proofs of all theorems. All we are doing in some sense is choosing what order to list them in. Okay. But the fact is that the number of proofs, correct or wrong, explodes at such a rapid rate because of the recursive structure that you'll never get anywhere if you just in a random order listed them. But just as a perspective, what is the act of doing mathematics? It's often amounts to simply choosing what to try next. I mean, since you could, if you tried everything, you would prove everything that has a proof. Okay. And what to try next, of course, that's where analogy and judgment and all these things come in. Okay. So, but back to my main theme. So in any language, we can have software that lists all proofs. That's what I was saying, because they are all recursive functions. So I could write a program, and any good programmer should do it in a week or less, a day if they're or whatever, which will just write down all the proofs of all theorems one after the other. As I said, to wait for a proof of any given theorem will take incredibly long, but in principle, you can list all proofs. And it also contains an interpreter. Okay? That is, runs all software in that language. But if you want to make this reasonably efficient, you take a subset of that language, which is good enough to enumerate all proofs and write an interpreter for itself. Okay. So there has to be, that's the sort of, as I said, paradoxical sounding thing, but it's not. So a full language plus this code will be rather long if you want to make things efficient. You don't try to write the whole language, you just take the subset of the language which enumerates all proofs. But that subset is not big enough to write an interpreter for itself. You'll have to enlarge it till you get this situation where it's big enough to write an interpreter for itself and does this. Okay, and so to come to the main point, so you have code which does this. Let m be the length of the code that does this, and a little more. I won't tell you what the little more is because it's minor bookkeeping issues. I mean, I'll implicitly tell you in the next slide. But so finally we come to the main point, which is Chetan's proof of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Okay, so let n be a number such that n is greater than m plus log 2 to the n. Since log grows much more slowly than n itself, you can always find an n which does this. So this is like hard analysis. We have n on both sides, but it's very easy hard analysis. Okay, so n is greater than m plus log 2 to the n. Okay, so Chetan makes the following definition. A program, let's look at programs with no input, which just have output, and you can say the output is just a single integer. Program without input is elegant if there is no shorter program with the same output. There could be a program with just the same length with the same output. Okay, it's elegant if there is nothing wasted in it. Okay, so it's a program whose output is an integer with no input, and it has the property that there is no shorter program which outputs the same integer with no input. Okay, and so here is the statement which tells you Gödel's incompleteness. Given any program P with length at least n, n is such a number, we cannot prove that it is elegant. Okay, let me tell you why. Otherwise, go on listing all the proofs. I told you we have code that can do it, till we see some proof that a program P of length at least n is elegant. Okay, so you have write code. What it will do is go on listing all the proofs. We have already included the code that does that, and see what the proof does. This is a little bit of additional code to do bookkeeping. See what we are proving. We are listing all proofs, see what we are proving. And as soon as you spot a statement which says that, keep doing this till you spot a statement which proves that, I mean, you spot a proof that some program P of length at least n is elegant. And then we have an interpreter, it will run this program P and give the output of P. What has this given? So it has given a shorter program with the same output as P. This is more or less like Berry's paradox, except that it works in rather than just leaving a paradox, it works to give you some theorem. Okay, so let me just say this again, since this is a subtle point. The subtle point is you have got a contradiction, just like Berry's paradox, where you had a description of a number which was shorter than its description. Okay, if you had a proof that some program of length at least n is elegant, then you use the interpreter. Then you keep looking for such a proof, and the first time you see such a proof, run that program and output it. Okay, the total length of the program that does all this is less than n, but it has the same output as the program of length n. Okay. Now, just a simple observation, I think like Manjunath's question earlier, there are infinitely many elegant programs of length at least n. This is for the silly reason that programs of length less than n are only finitely many, so they have only finitely many possible outputs. If you avoid these finitely many possible outputs, or if you then you end up with a elegant program of length at least n. And in fact, it's a little exercise to make a single statement by taking OR of a bunch of statements, which is going to be true, but you can't prove it. Okay, otherwise you get this kind of a logical contradiction. So this is a couple of comments about this, as I said. So there is a complexity bound. In fact, among blogs and so on, there was some speculation how big this bound is. Apparently only a few thousand bytes or something. So in some sense, you can never prove that whatever pattern you see anywhere needs more than about 1,000 bytes to generate it. And so fairly short programs can generate extremely complex patterns, which leads to various interesting things, including various crackpot interesting things below, but you would have seen this. Now, a minor comment here. So, I have sketched Chaitin's proof. What was Gödel's original proof? It was a similar diagonal argument involving involving something called Gödel numbering, which embedded all of logic in integers. Now, if you translate it down to logic, this may not actually be simpler than Gödel's proof. This may be just as hard as Gödel's proof. The point is that intermediate steps all make a lot of sense to us. That's why this seems much more simple. Okay, so this is, yeah. That's why n has been chosen. See, what is the code needed for this? There's a code needed to generate all the proofs and an interpreter. Both of those fit here. An important point I didn't say. What is the code needed to make this? Okay, you need to have code to enumerate all proofs, an interpreter, then a little bit of code to check that the theorem you prove is really saying this, that the program of length p is n. And you also need the constant n to be fed into this, and that has log 2 to the base 2n digits. So I can write a code with length m plus log 2 to the base n, which does this, and n is greater than that. So the code needed to do these 3 steps is the right hand side of this inequality. Okay, because the right hand side, the term m includes writing numbers, listing proofs, the interpreter, and a little more for bookkeeping, and a constant n, which has to be fed in for this. Okay, and then you get, so the right hand side is the length of this program. Okay, but the n is greater than that, so you have got a shorter program. So this contradiction gives you. Now, as soon as you have enough, so integers are enough to write a language in which you can write an interpreter and in which you can define all recursive functions. So as soon as you have enough starting point for that, you get, in fact, Gödel's completeness theorem tells you that without integers, the first order logic itself is complete. So this paradox doesn't come always. You need enough to start with, and what you need enough to start with is to make sense of these notions of language and so on. The other thing I should mention is that whatever your rules of deduction are, as long as they're consistent, this argument works. I didn't explicitly use what are the rules of deduction, just so long as we can enumerate everything according to those rules of deduction. Okay. Oh, sorry. So this is almost the end, but I will have a brief return to the natural language processing with which I started this talk with a little advertisement break. Okay, so here's the break for an advertisement, especially for students. Well, how do you learn about the parsers? Coursera and Udacity, both starting this year, give you online courses, and you learn lots of valuable things. I have myself taken one course from Udacity and in the middle of a second one. So Coursera has a natural language processing course where you learn all these things. These are online free courses and they're very good. This one is taught by the same group who made the Stanford parser, which is the best around, probably the best in the world. This was started by the person, Sebastian Thrun, who designed a self-driving car for Google, which you may have or may not have heard of. Okay, so I'll just want to alert as many people as possible to the existence of these and say that you should supplement your education, whatever you're learning, whatever stage in life you are, with this material, which is, I'll come back to this if anyone wants. So I'll just end with some few comments, as I said. So we started with natural language parsing, but then I moved on into logic, and we saw that the richness of recursion is enough to give you interesting things. Okay? But what about actually understanding a sentence with the recursive structure? So why is it hard? What is the problem? So the problem we started with is, given a sentence, parse it, and parse it correctly. Why is it very hard? It's hard because any sentence has a very large number of legal parses. So given a sentence, typical sentence, you try, which is reasonably long, and you try to break it by the rules into noun phrases and verb phrases and so on. The rules of grammar allow a large number of legal parses. And for many, many years, the effort was that you make rules stricter. Well, if you make them too strict, you will just have no parsers at all. And if you make them lenient, you end up with lots of parsers. And there's no way out of this. I mean, many, many decades of effort left to this. Okay? So what was the solution? You look at data. Don't think with logic, think with data. And look for likely parsers. Okay? Look for how sentences are. For example, if a given word can be both an adjective or a noun, you can write any number of rules of grammar for when it's adjective or noun. But the easiest way to, the most single strongest predictor of what it is just whether it's more often an adjective or a noun. Ignore everything else. That is still better. Of course, combining is better, but by far the dominant role in this is looking at data. Many of us will be familiar with Google's Translate, which is a purely database thing. Of course, there they had, and in 2006 they won a competition for the best translations, and the source languages were Arabic and Chinese, and target was English, and none of the programmers knew either Arabic or Chinese, a word of it, but it was still the best. So all the rules of grammar for the translation task, well, here were people who knew nothing at all of the language. It was still better to just look at data. Okay? So just a few general comments. I think this is an experience in many situations. What is the relevance of this? In some sense, when you're doing mathematics, you're following, especially if you're modeling the world with mathematics, you're following the first approach. Okay? I guess I've learned this the hard way while dabbling in molecular biology. Mathematical way of thinking is you think of rules, and if they are not good enough to give you the answer, you add more. And if they are so strong that they don't fit the data, you add less. But apparently that in many contexts in real life works very poorly. In fact, it works so well in some parts of physics that you have whole books about universal constants, because these are the only things you actually extract from data rather than from reasoning. The expectation is somehow you can even extract these from reasoning. But in many, many other things, certainly in biology, which is a evolutionary history, in fact, looking at data seems to be much more powerful than this. So what the role of mathematics is in the data-driven world. In fact, Professor Varadan also commented about how statistics are having less and less to do with probability these days. It's become an almost entirely data-driven field. Okay, I'm not an expert to judge this, but I'm quoting someone whom nobody will dispute is an expert to make such a comment. So this is the thing, and I think just a much more practical point. This is a broader philosophical point. And just a much more practical point is that it means if you're a student of mathematics and you have hopes for diversity, you have to pick up some skills, some basic programming, some statistics, and some problems. Okay, if your university doesn't provide it, go to university. So on the flip side, let me just end with a couple of remarks. It may not be very meaningful. Well, this is a principle that we have all experimental psychology and neuroscience and so on will tell you. You see only what you expect to see. And what this data-driven thing suggests is maybe this is for good reason. The good reason that if you consider all possibilities, you'll never get anywhere. But of course, this has a very big limitation. That is, what if something is completely unfamiliar? You just not see it. So in this case, on the flip side of what I said earlier, a role of mathematics in the world is that a lot of new structures have come into mathematics first, and then you see them in science and engineering. This is, for example, matrices in quantum mechanics or curvature in relativity. There are many examples, or even in some sense, Boltzmann's entropy coming before Shannon's information theory. So this is a general remark that mathematics somehow is quite good at generating all sorts of new kinds of structures, etc. And since we have this cognitive problem, and it may not be a problem but a solution, but nevertheless it's partly a problem, that if something is utterly unfamiliar, you won't see it. If there is a structure in nature which is completely unfamiliar, then you won't recognize it at all. But maybe it is familiar because you saw it first in a purely mathematical context. Historically, this has happened many times. So with these general remarks, I'll end. Give it some more general remarks. This is the book I mentioned. On related topics, here are a couple of other popular books. Thank you.
Any questions or comments?
I just wanted to test my understanding of Chetan's proof.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that Chetan's proof of Gödel's incompleteness is to Gödel's proof what his proof of the infinitude of primes is to Euclid's proof? Or
May not be.
I mean, there's some quantitative thing here.
I don't know. Oh, that was a proof by contradiction.
Right.
Somehow I feel that Chetan's proof of Gödel's incompleteness is much closer to Gödel's proof than the two corresponding proofs of infinitely many primes. Yeah, there is right. That so you had Chetan, Gödel's proof and then Turing's and Chetan's, and gaps are not that much. In the case of infinitely many primes, maybe it's really much more of a new proof.
One more question.
Yeah.
So this Udacity and Coursera, are
Yeah.
any of these platforms available for us to sort of adopt and use?
To propagate.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll tell you more about it. So they have rather different models. They are both private companies. Udacity makes its own material. Okay? And they have focused a lot on practical courses, computer science, and took a Python programming course and so on from them. Where the applications, as you see, we'll go to that slide, so we can see there are things that are here. Well, this is just the new courses, that's why they're featured. That's a statistics course. This is the original one, programming, artificial intelligence is what Trune is in. So it was an offshoot of Stanford in some sense, it's a private company. But Coursera has again a private company, but its model is to tie up with universities to offer courses from universities. And originally their courses came from Stanford, but then they came from University of Michigan, and now they have come from about 6 or 7 all North American universities. They may very well be open to expanding elsewhere in the world. So since their model seems to be to collaborate with academic institutions. No, I've thought about this a lot. You see, because having taken Udacity course, you realize there are various features about this which are true. The most important one is being made for online. I guess these are things you learn from experience. They have short clips because attention span of watching a video is not that long. Can't really watch a 1 hour video that easily. And then they have embedded questions. And then you have another short clip and then some more questions. So that keeps you involved for much longer and so on. But the other key point which works so well in Udacity's programming courses is you write programs. And a computer then runs and tests and tells you whether they are correct or not. So the problem with the more advanced mathematics schools is that as yet you don't have an interface where you can force people to write proofs. And computer checks whether they're correct proofs or not. Okay. So multiple choice questions are easy. I mean, it should be easy even if it's not done in their existing software. It should be easy enough to check numerical answers, of course, but even functional answers. But checking an actual proof is the sort of the real conceptual limitation to the sort of courses we teach in everyday life going into this module. But if one thinks of mathematics courses below that level, they are already coming in. I mean, there are some, I think. So there's a third one now, edX, which is Harvard and MIT are collaborating with it. It's a non-profit, and it's not a private company. So what happens? So that's the conceptual thing. As far as technical things are concerned, I would think, given Coursera's model, they will be willing to branch out. But as I said, with this main constraint that they have a self-grading system, You have 100,000 people taking a course in so on. And the whole point about this is that you can do it. And there are many other features we get. I mean, so if you sort of accept, and it's not so difficult to write the software. So in some sense, even if one doesn't tie up with them, one can just sort of parallelly try to learn from their experience and do it. And one of the things, as I said, actually having code is the best, but otherwise the nudges with interruption and questions helps a lot. But the other thing is what Thrun says. So the original course was, which started this was Sebastian Thrun had this course on artificial intelligence, which he just took online, and had 30,000 people taking it, in fact completing it. And he found that in a Stanford class of about 160, he had big classes, really popular, only 30 continued to attend class, everyone else took it online. And then he asked them, well, you're paying all these fees to see me, the famous professor in action, and why are you watching the videos instead? And they said, well, professor, we can rewind you at home. So, and he said, what about interaction? Of course, it was a class of 160. So in practice, well, you interact with only about 5 students. I mean, how many students in so that's the other point, that every student is asked a question, the same question. The flip, as I said, if you're thinking of mathematics, is proofs cannot be discussed, I mean, as yet at least. It's a very hard task to have auto-evaluation of proofs.
Any other comment or question? If not, let us thank